In the shadow of the Cascade Mountains, where wilderness meets solitude, 78-year-old Eleanor Morgan has lived a quiet life since losing her husband 15 years ago. Her modest cabin at the edge of Pinterest has withstood decades of harsh winters. Just like Ellie herself, steady, resilient, and rooted like the trees around her, she remains unyielding to the march of time. But her life takes an unexpected turn when 4 orphaned bobcat cubs, trembling and vulnerable, show up on her doorstep. These aren't ordinary kittens. As they grow and their wild instincts awaken, an extraordinary bond forms between them and Ellie. Yet, as storms batter the mountains, a far greater tempest begins to brew in Ellie's life. Now she must summon all her strength, not only to protect her new family, but to face threats more dangerous and personal than she ever imagined. Before we begin, don't forget to like this video, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you won't miss any of our upcoming stories. The small town of Pinterest, nestled in the foothills of the Cascade Mountains, was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone's business. Time moved slower there than in the bustling cities just a few hours away. On the edge of town, where paved roads gave way to dirt trails and eventually dense forest, stood a modest cabin that had weathered over 70 winters. It belonged to Eleanor Morgan, known simply as Miss Ellie. At 78, she had deep smile lines etched around her eyes and kept her silver hair in a practical braid. Her hands bore the calluses of decades spent gardening, teaching, and simply surviving. In a place where nature could be both breathtaking and brutal. Ellie had spent 43 years teaching at Pinterest Elementary. Nearly every family in town had sent at least one child through her classroom. She hadn't always lived alone. She and her husband Frank had raised their daughter Sarah in that very cabin. Before Sarah moved to Seattle to become a doctor, Frank had passed away nearly 15 years ago, his heart giving out one frigid morning while chopping wood. Since then, Ellie had grown used to solitude, finding comfort in her garden, her books, and the occasional visit from neighbors or former students. "You really should consider moving into town," Sheriff Michael Jenkins, one of her former students, would say during his monthly check-ins. "Or at least think about moving closer to Sarah in the city." Ellie would just smile. "This is my home, Michael. These mountains know me, and I know them. Besides," she'd add with a wink, "who would keep an eye on all you troublemakers if I left?" What she didn't say was that leaving the cabin would feel like abandoning Frank. His presence lingered there, in the worn floorboards, the porch rocking chair, the workshop behind the house where his tools still hung, untouched and waiting. Everything changed one early April morning. The ground was damp from the last of the snowmelt, but wildflowers had begun to dot the landscape with bursts of color. Ellie was working in her garden, hands deep in the soil, when she heard the familiar rumble of an old truck. It was Jake Thompson, the Pinterest game warden, and another of her former students. Now in his early 40s, Jake's face was weathered. From years spent outdoors, his eyes kind but tired. "Morning, Miss Ellie," he called as he stepped from his truck. There was something in his voice, an urgency that made Ellie straighten. "What brings you out here, Jake?" she asked, brushing dirt from her hands. Jake reached into the cab and pulled out a large wooden crate. "Found something I thought you might be able to help with," he said, setting it gently down. Ellie looked inside, and her breath caught. 4 tiny bobcat cubs, their spotted fur still fluffy. Their eyes, bright blue, were huddled together. They looked to be only a few weeks old. "Their mother was hit by a logging truck up on Ridge Road," Jake said quietly. "By the time I got there, she was gone. Found these little ones in a hollow log nearby. Must have heard the noise and hidden." "Poor things," Ellie murmured, reaching in to stroke one. It hissed softly, more out of fear than aggression. "What's the plan for them?" Jake sighed. "The rehab center in Portland's swamped. Can't take them for at least 2 weeks. I can't keep them with my dogs. And, well, I thought of you." Ellie raised an eyebrow. "You thought of me?" Jake shrugged. "You always had a way with animals. Miss Ellie, remember that hawk you nursed back in 5th grade? These little ones need warmth, feeding every few hours. and someone who won't get too attached. Just temporary? Ellie asked, eyes never leaving the cubs. Jake nodded. Once they're weaned, they'll go to the center to be trained for release. Ellie looked at the small, frightened faces. She thought of her quiet home and the long, empty evenings. Well, she said, I suppose the garden can wait. Let's get them inside. And just like that, Eleanor Morgan, retired schoolteacher and widow, became the unlikely mother of 4 wild bobcats. The first few days were a crash course in wildlife care. Jake brought formula from the vet clinic, along with feeding syringes, heating pads, and a wildlife rehab guide. He also gave a stern reminder, these aren't pets, they're wild animals, healthy, not domesticated. That's the goal. Ellie nodded solemnly, but inside her heart was already captured. Despite Jake's warnings, she named them. The largest male became Rusty for his reddish fur. The tiniest, most vocal female was Scout. The curious explorer was Ranger, and the quiet, watchful one she called Shadow. Every 3 hours, day and night, Ellie fed them with syringes, cleaned them with warm cloths to mimic their mother's tongue, and made them a cozy den from blankets and heating pads in the spare bedroom. Weeks passed. The cubs' blue eyes turned golden. Their fluffy coats grew into the sleek patterns of juvenile bobcats. They became more active, more mischievous, and far more destructive. You should see what they did to my throw pillows. Ellie chuckled to Sarah over the phone. Looked like it snowed stuffing. Mom, Sarah said, worried, are you sure this is safe? Bobcats aren't house cats. Nonsense, Ellie replied, watching Ranger stalk a toy mouse. They know me. I'm the hand that feeds them. Still, as the cubs grew, Ellie couldn't ignore the truth. They were getting strong and their play was turning rough. When Jake visited, he was amazed at their health, but concerned at how unafraid they were of humans. They should be more wary, he said, pulling Scout away from his shoelace. We need to start the transition. Ellie's heart ached, but she nodded. They need to learn to be wild, but they're still so young. Jake studied her face. Let's compromise. We'll build an outdoor enclosure here, give them more space, natural surroundings, and less human interaction. Gradually, they'll be ready for the center. With Jake's help, and a few trusted townsfolk sworn to secrecy, they built a large enclosure beside the cabin. It had climbing branches, hiding spots, and forest floor underfoot. The cubs moved in, and Ellie, with effort, began the painful process of letting go. Ellie had begun to distance herself from the animals she had nurtured. She still prepared their meals, but now they were whole prey, mice and rats from the pet store at first, then rabbits as the bobcats grew larger. She wore a mask when entering the enclosure so they wouldn't associate human faces with food. She spent less time with them directly, observing instead from the cabin window as they roamed, played, and honed the skills essential for survival. Yet on quiet evenings, she sometimes couldn't help herself. She'd bring out a chair and sit by their enclosure, reading aloud from whatever book she was enjoying. The bobcats would often pause, ears twitching in her direction. Rusty especially would lie near the fence, seemingly listening. I know, she'd say with a rueful smile. I'm breaking all the rules, but an old woman gets lonely. You're good company. As summer came to the Cascades, the days lengthened and warmed. The bobcats were now adolescents, about the size of house cats but more solid, with distinctive tufts and stubby tails. By now, they should have been transferred to the rehabilitation center, but delays kept piling up. Staff shortages, space issues, then a forest fire that displaced other wildlife. It's not ideal, Jake admitted on one of his visits. They're getting older. The longer they stay, the harder it might be for them to go fully wild. But Ellie had noticed changes. The bobcats were already turning more wild, more nocturnal, more elusive. They'd vanish when strangers appeared and had begun hunting small, live prey in their enclosure, chipmunks, birds, even a curious squirrel. One late July evening, Ellie noticed something wrong as she brought their dinner, rabbits for each. The latch on the enclosure was loose. Maybe the recent storm, maybe the cats themselves. Her stomach sank. If they pushed it, they could get out. She froze, then carefully placed their food inside and secured the latch as best she could. Back in the cabin, she called Jake. "I'll be there first thing with proper materials," he promised. "Want me to come now? I can be there in an hour." Ellie looked toward the enclosure. The Bobcats were eating calmly. "No, I think it'll hold," she said. "They seem settled." That night, sleep eluded her. She rose several times, shining her flashlight out the window, checking that all four were still inside. By dawn, she sat on her porch with coffee, watching them sleep curled in a heap. Jake arrived as promised. Together, they reinforced the structure. But the incident had shaken them both. "It's time, isn't it?" Ellie said quietly. Jake nodded. "They're ready. The rehab center has space now. These four need the next step." Ellie agreed. The Bobcats were no longer interested in her presence. They'd turned their attention to scents, movements, and the quiet sounds of the world outside the fence. They were becoming what they were meant to be. 3 days later, Jake returned with transport crates and 2 rehab center staff. Them proved stressful. Though raised by humans, the cats now resisted handling, lashing out, scrambling away. It took hours to safely crate them. As the last, Rusty, was loaded, Ellie felt tears rise. She reached out, touching the crate. Rusty hissed. No longer the helpless cub she had fed at midnight. "It's okay," she whispered. "This is how it should be." Jake gently put his arm around her. "You did good, Miss Ellie. You gave them a chance at life, and now a chance at freedom." Ellie nodded, unable to speak, watching as the truck disappeared with 4 pieces of her heart. Autumn arrived, turning the mountains golden and crimson. Ellie canned tomatoes, made apple butter from her orchard. Days shortened, nights grew cold. Jake visited now and then with updates. The Bobcats were doing well, bigger, independent, behaving as wild animals should. They were being kept together, which was rare but working. "We've never seen a sibling group like this," Jake told her one morning. "They hunt cooperatively, very unusual for Bobcats." Ellie smiled, proud. They had to depend on each other from the beginning, and they had a human mother who read them. Too much Jack London. Maybe they picked up a thing or two. Life returned to its familiar rhythm. Ellie joined the senior center's book club, baked for school fundraisers, prepared her home for winter. She avoided thinking too often about the Bobcats. Their enclosure remained standing. She couldn't bring herself to take it down. Then came the season's first snow. A light dusting transformed the landscape. That morning, the rehab center called. The Bobcats had been released the day before, deep in the national forest. The release went smoothly. After a brief hesitation, all 4 had slipped into the trees together. "They're truly wild now, Miss Ellie," Jake said. "They'll find their way." Ellie thanked him, then sat on her porch swing, wrapped in a thick blanket, watching snowflakes fall. A mix of sadness and satisfaction filled her. The Bobcats had been her purpose when she feared she had none left. Now they were where they belonged. And that warmed her heart despite the cold. Winter deepened. Heavy snow sometimes made roads impassable for days. Ellie stocked up, prepared for long stretches of solitude. It was during one such snowstorm, 3 weeks before Christmas, that trouble came. Daylight faded early. Wind howled around the cabin. Ellie had just stoked the fire, settled in with tea and a book, when she heard the crunch of tires on her driveway. Peering through the snow, she spotted a truck, not Jake's, not one she recognized. In a town like Pinterest, she knew every vehicle by sight. 2 men emerged, bundled against the cold, making their way toward her porch. Unease prickled down her spine. Visitors were rare in good weather, let alone a storm, unless it was urgent. Still, small-town hospitality reflexes ran deep. She opened the door as they reached the steps. "Can I help you?" she asked. They looked up. Something in their eyes made her wariness sharpen. They didn't have the open expressions of neighbors or the urgency of those needing help. "Ms. Morgan?" the taller one asked. Middle-aged, scruffy beard, eyes scanning past her into the cabin. "We're with the power company. Got a report of downed lines. Mind if we come in and use your phone? Our radio's out." Ellie didn't buy it for a second. Her power was still on. Real utility workers had ID, logoed vehicles, and wouldn't. Use her name like they'd heard it secondhand. I'm afraid the line's been down since yesterday, she said evenly. You might try the Hendersons, about 2 miles back. They've got a satellite phone. The shorter man stepped forward. Thin, sharp-eyed. Look, lady, it's freezing. Just let us in for a minute. Warm up. Her grip tightened on the doorknob. I'm sorry, I don't know you. I don't let strangers in. There's a community shelter in town. The taller man's face darkened. I don't think you understand the situation. His hand moved toward his jacket, and Ellie saw the unmistakable outline of a gun. Fear surged, but years of handling unruly fourth graders had taught her something vital. Never show weakness. I understand, she said. Perfectly, she said, her voice remarkably calm. And I should tell you that Sheriff Jenkins checks on me daily in this weather. He's due any minute now. It was another lie. Michael only came by weekly and he'd visited just yesterday, but she hoped it might give them pause. The shorter man laughed. Nice try, old woman. We know the sheriff's stuck in town with a multi-car pileup on the highway. No one's coming to check on you tonight. Ellie's blood ran cold. They'd done their homework. These weren't opportunistic drifters. They had targeted her specifically. Her mind raced to the rumors she'd heard in town recently about break-ins at remote homes, particularly those belonging to elderly residents who might have valuables or medications. What do you want? She asked, stalling for time as she tried to think of options. Her phone was in the kitchen. Her late husband's shotgun was locked in a cabinet in the bedroom, unloaded, with ammunition stored separately, as she'd been taught. Neither was within reach. We'll start with whatever cash you have, the taller man said. Then maybe some of those nice antiques I can see from here. And we know old folks like you usually have good prescription meds. As he spoke, he pushed forward, forcing Ellie to step back into her own home. The shorter man followed, closing the door behind them and immediately beginning to scan the room for valuables. The cash is in a jar in the kitchen cupboard, Ellie said, hoping compliance might keep the situation from escalating. I don't have much, just emergency money. Show me, the taller man ordered, gesturing with the gun now openly in his hand. Ellie led the way to the kitchen, her mind still frantically searching for a way out of this nightmare. As they passed the back door that led to her garden and the now empty Bobcat enclosure beyond, she noticed it wasn't fully latched. Had she left it that way after bringing in firewood earlier? It might offer an escape route if she could create a diversion. In the kitchen, she slowly reached for a cabinet, opening it to reveal a row of canning jars. It's in one of these, she said, her hands shaking now, not entirely from fear, but with the beginnings of a plan. The man stepped closer, impatient. Hurry up, Grandma. We don't have all night. As Ellie reached for a jar on the top shelf, she deliberately knocked several others off, sending them crashing to the floor in an explosion of glass and preserved tomatoes. In the moment of startled confusion, she bolted for the back door, throwing it open and running into the snowy darkness. She heard cursing behind her, then the sound of pursuit. At 78, Ellie was no match for younger men in a foot race, especially in deep snow. Her only hope was to reach the shed behind the cabin, which had a lock on the inside, and a window she might be able to climb through to circle back to her truck. She was halfway to the shed when her foot caught on a hidden root, sending her sprawling. Face first into the snow, pain shot through her ankle as she tried to stand. Not broken, she thought, but definitely sprained. Behind her, flashlight beams cut through the darkness as both men emerged from the cabin. You're only making this worse for yourself, the taller one called, his voice tight with anger. Ellie tried to crawl toward the shed, but the pain in her ankle in the deep snow made progress almost impossible. The men's footsteps crunched closer in the snow. This was it, she thought. After all these years of independence, of proving she could manage on her own, she was going to fall victim to the very scenario Sarah and Michael had warned her about. Then she heard something else. A low, rumbling growl from the darkness to her right. The sound was primal, raising the hairs on the back of her neck despite the dire situation with her human pursuers. The men heard it too. Their flashlight beams swung wildly toward the sound. "What the hell was that?" the shorter man asked, his voice suddenly uncertain. Before anyone could answer, a blur of motion erupted from the shadows. Something large and fast slammed into the shorter man, knocking him off his feet with a cry of shock and pain. In the chaotic swinging of the remaining flashlight, Ellie caught glimpses of a tawny, spotted coat and powerful limbs. A bobcat, not just any bobcat. It was large, adult-sized, and it wasn't alone. 3 more shapes materialized from the darkness, circling the men with threatening growls. The taller man fired his gun wildly, the muzzle flash briefly illuminating the scene in stark detail. 4 adult bobcats positioned strategically around the humans, their eyes reflecting the light like golden lamps. "Jesus Christ," he shouted, firing again and backing toward the cabin. "Get these things away from us." The shorter man was struggling to his feet, his arm bleeding from what appeared to be claw marks. "Let's get out of here," he yelled, abandoning any thought of robbery in the face of this unexpected threat. Both men retreated hastily toward their truck. One fired another warning shot that went wide, the other stumbled and slipped in his panic. The bobcats followed, not attacking directly now, but keeping the pressure on, ensuring the retreat continued. Ellie watched in stunned disbelief as the men climbed into their truck. The engine roared to life and they backed down her driveway, at dangerous speed, nearly colliding with a tree before disappearing into the snowy night. Silence fell, broken only by the wind and the soft padding of paws in snow. Ellie became acutely aware of her vulnerable position, lying injured in the cold. The bobcats had chased off the intruders, but they were wild predators themselves. Would they now see her as prey? Slowly, cautiously, she pushed herself to a sitting position. Her ankle throbbed, and she was beginning to feel the cold seeping through her clothes. The bobcats had gathered a short distance away, watching her with inscrutable yellow eyes. "Well," she said aloud, her voice shaking slightly, "I suppose I should thank you, whoever you are." One of the bobcats stepped forward, the largest male, with distinctive markings that stirred something in Ellie's memory. He approached slowly, stopping just a few feet away from her. He sniffed the air, then made a chuffing sound that seemed almost like recognition. "Rusty," Ellie whispered, hardly daring to hope. "Is that you, boy?" The bobcat tilted his head, and in that moment, despite all logic and wildlife biology, Ellie was certain these weren't just any bobcats. These were her bobcats, Rusty, Scout, Ranger, and Shadow. Somehow they had found their way back to the place where they had been raised, to the human who had saved them when they were helpless kittens. "You impossible creatures," she said, tears freezing on her cheeks in the cold air. "You're supposed to be 20 miles away in the national forest." Rusty took another step closer, then another until he was near enough that Ellie could feel the heat radiating from his body. He sniffed her outstretched hand, then turned and made a sound to the others. To Ellie's amazement, they formed a loose circle around her, their bodies creating a windbreak against the driving snow. Understanding dawned on her. They weren't going to harm her. Somehow, against all odds and expert predictions, these wild animals remembered her. More than that, they were protecting her. Emboldened, Ellie spoke again. "I need to get back to the cabin," she said as if they could understand. "My ankles hurt." She began the painful process of standing, using a nearby tree for support. The bobcats watched, alert but not interfering. Once she was upright, balancing on her good foot, she began to hop awkwardly toward the cabin, using trees and shrubs for balance where she could. The bobcats moved with her, staying close but not touching, maintaining their protective formation. It was slow progress through the deepening snow, but eventually Ellie reached her back porch. The steps presented a challenge with her injured ankle, but she managed to pull herself up using the railing. At the door, she paused and looked back. The 4 bobcats sat in the snow watching her. They made no move to follow her inside, seeming to understand that the human dwelling wasn't their territory. "Thank you," she said simply. "You saved my life tonight." She hobbled inside to call the sheriff and report the attempted robbery. As she waited for help to arrive, she kept glancing out the window, expecting the Bobcats to disappear back into the forest. But they remained, settled in the snow around her cabin like sentinels. When Sheriff Michael Jenkins finally arrived the next morning, having battled through snow-blocked roads with a deputy and a town doctor, he found Ellie safe in her cabin with a wrapped ankle and an incredible story to tell. "Bobcats," he repeated, skeptically after Ellie had recounted the previous night's events. "You're saying 4 Bobcats chased off armed robbers?" "I know how it sounds," Ellie admitted, "but I'm not senile yet, Michael. Look at the tracks in the snow if you don't believe me." The sheriff and his deputy did investigate the area around the cabin and found evidence supporting Ellie's story. Footprints of 2 men running back to where tire tracks showed a vehicle had been parked, and unmistakable Bobcat tracks circling the area. They also found blood in the snow that didn't belong to Ellie, supporting her claim that one of the men had been clawed. "I'll be damned," Michael said when he returned inside. "But why would wild Bobcats defend a human? It goes against everything we know about their behavior." Ellie exchanged a glance with Jake, who had arrived after hearing about the incident on the police radio. They had never fully explained to the community what had been happening at Ellie's cabin the previous spring and summer. "Maybe they weren't entirely wild," Jake suggested carefully. Over coffee, they explained the full story to the sheriff, how Ellie had raised the orphaned Bobcats, how they had been rehabilitated and released into the wild, and how, against all odds, they appeared to have found their way back to the place they associated with safety and care. "They remembered you," Michael said wonderingly. "After all these months in the wild, they remembered the human who saved them, and they returned the favor." "It seems that way," Ellie agreed, "though any wildlife biologist would tell you it's impossible." "Well, I've lived in these mountains my whole life," Michael said, "and I've learned that impossible is just a word people use when they can't explain something." In the days that followed, as news of the incident spread through Pinehurst, people began to report occasional sightings of Bobcats near Ellie's property. They never approached other humans and fled if anyone tried to get close, but they remained in the vicinity, establishing a territory that happened to include the cabin of a certain elderly schoolteacher. As for Ellie, she finally agreed to Sarah's repeated suggestion to install a security system, though she insisted with a smile that she already had the best protection any mountain resident could ask for. She also adopted a large dog from the county shelter, not for protection, she claimed, but for company. The Bobcat seemed to accept the dog's presence with cautious tolerance, perhaps understanding that it was part of Ellie's family group. When spring returned to the Cascades, bringing with it new wildflowers and longer days, Ellie would often sit on her porch in the evenings with her dog at her feet. Sometimes, as twilight settled over the mountains, she would glimpse shapes moving at the edge of the forest. 4 Bobcats going about their wild lives, but never straying too far from the cabin where they had once been given a second chance at life. And on particularly quiet nights when the wind was still and the moon was bright, Ellie would read aloud from whatever book she was enjoying, her voice carrying across her garden to the listening wilderness beyond. Whether the Bobcats understood the words didn't matter. What mattered was the connection, an unlikely bond between species that transcended the usual boundaries between wild and tame, between giving and receiving protection. In a world that often emphasized the divisions between humans and the natural, Ellie and her Bobcats had found something rare and precious. A circle of care that flowed both ways, proof that kindness, once offered freely, sometimes returns when it's needed most.